Thank you.
A story is told in my family that a few days before I was born, my father introduced Eugene McCarthy at a rally in the New Hampshire Democratic primary. You remember it was Eugene McCarthy's strength in that New Hampshire election, running against the Vietnam War, that would drive President Lyndon Johnson from the race. After the rally, Eugene McCarthy, professional politician, came up to my father and said, "David Copperthorne, that was the best introduction I've had in my entire career." My father, already elated at the impending birth of his second child, was seduced by this powerful praise. And when I was born a boy, a few days later, he was determined to name me after his hero, Eugene. My mother, she didn't like the sound of that name, and emboldened by her consciousness raising group, she dug her heels in, and I went without a name for 2 weeks. Now, you all know how that story turned out, right? But the point of telling it is, brings up a couple of observations about my childhood. First is the church in my family was this New Hampshire Democratic primary. My parents had a passion for justice, a solidarity with people in poverty that they demonstrated in what they said and in how they lived their lives. They carefully picked the right liberal candidate and then worked hard to advance them in the primary. I remember licking candy canes and envelopes on the floor of the Belknap County campaign office my parents ran for George McGovern. Mo Udall taught me how to shake hands in my living room. I presented an award to Ted Kennedy from the Guilford Middle School Magic Club, and I worked for weeks for Gary Hart. And when I was young, I dreamed of being a senator. The other observation is I'm really among the first to grow up in a feminist family. My parents both underwent the radical transformation of feminism in their own lives, and no generation in history has contributed more to human progress than that. I understand the beginning of my religious journey when I was 13 and 14, and my father became fascinated with the Carlos Castaneda books and urged me to read them. At the time, they could be understood to be a nonfiction account of a UCLA graduate student in anthropology who became an apprentice to a Yaqui Indian shaman. Went on peyote trips, among other practices, to access a spirit world for knowledge and power. I remember going into the woods behind my house, trying to put these things I was reading into practice. And it was the first time I could understand consciousness as territory that could be explored or trained. I remember my first religious experience. I was 15 years old, and I went to a youth conference on the island off the coast of New Hampshire. It had these 200 dazzlingly charismatic teenagers, punks and hippies, artists and activists. In any other adolescent environment, these groups would have spun out into competing rivalries. But under the influence of the island, the spirit of group love grew into this ecstatic joy that seemed to include each one of us. And if I tell you that story, I'd pause for a moment to say to invite that possibility among us. It's really not far. Later, I would go be an exchange student in Germany, and somewhere along the way, I picked up a book by Aldous Huxley, and I picked it up because I recognized him as the author of The Doors of Perception, and I couldn't buy or borrow that book. With this book, The Perennial Philosophy explored what he called mysticism, which is how the contemplative dimension of the world's religions converge on the same themes and approaches. I remember sitting in a hotel lobby in Heidelberg, tears streaming down my face halfway through this book, and vowing that this would what my life would be about, to grow in love and prayer. Later that year, I'd visit my cousin in Amsterdam, and she had married this dashing Dutch artist. They had spent years studying Buddhism in Kashmir, and they were able to arrange for an audience with Lama Zopa Rinpoche. I was taken to this small room. He spoke English, and I'm introduced as a 16-year-old from America. He said, "Oh, from America. Do you know my friend from Michigan?" No, Rinpoche, I don't know. Your friend from Michigan. Oh, I see. I see. Very good. Very good. Do you know my friend from California? No, Rinpoche, I don't know your friend from California. Oh, I see. I see. Very good. Even as the words he was saying were this insipid chatter, the gravity of his presence was such that just to stand next to him was to experience his love, emptiness, joy, no self. And I walked away from our brief encounter amazed that this man had learned to communicate the truth without language. And I thought he had accomplished something worthwhile with his life. I identified as a Tibetan Buddhist after that. And when I came back to America, I'd travel across the state to join a Tibetan retreat center. I met lamas and people with a daily meditation practice. But what I remember most vividly about that is feeling awkward and embarrassed as a teenager in an adult environment. And if I tell that story, I tell you, if you feel awkward or embarrassed in this community, you also belong here. I would spend a season being connected to my religious purpose and filled with happiness, or disconnected to it and fall into a deep depression. And I was trained with some brutal efficiency that I had to be consistent about religious practice, and I have been at least since I was 19. I didn't even want to go to college. I wanted to join a monastery, but I didn't really know what that meant or how. And when I got into Harvard, it was too glittering an opportunity to turn down. I went to Harvard, I was majoring in religion, and I was taking courses in Tibetan Buddhism. And I could see what a sturdy philosophy it was. You know, nobody becomes a Tibetan Buddhist and becomes more narrow or hateful. But still, I didn't really have an emotional connection to this material. If I saw a tanka of a Tara or a Garuda, that seemed different. But if I saw an icon of Jesus Christ or a saint, I was connected to it in my heart. If I heard Tibetan polyphonic chanting, okay, that was different. But if I heard Gregorian chanting or a mass by Bach, that was beautiful to me. And it seemed that even though I was never raised a Christian, as a Western person, Christianity was written in an emotional alphabet I could read. And that was worth exploring. I began reading Christian mystics, and in time I had a conversion experience where I came to understand it was possible to have a relationship with Jesus Christ. In finding that relationship, I was baptized and confirmed in the Roman Catholic Church at St. Paul's in Cambridge. I would spend summers in a monastery in Abiquiu, New Mexico, famous for where Georgia O'Keeffe painted, or a monastery in upstate New York. And I remember those being very happy times, praying 7 times a day, living in the wilderness. After college, I went traveling through India, and I returned to live in New York City with a woman I would come to marry. And I was working at Oxford University Press, and going to mass 4 or 5 times a week and teaching Sunday school. But even as I could see Catholicism on the scale of a monastery and see a healthy, vital, creative community, when Catholicism was what I was reading in the newspaper, I saw a sewer of anti-humanism. I looked into Reform Catholic groups, but it clearly seemed like no fun to be a dissident in an authoritarian institution. And I began looking for the exit of my predicament. Around this time, I came across the 3rd issue of Tricycle, the Buddhist Review, and I instantly recognized this New York City art world Buddhism as more culturally familiar to me than Roman Catholicism. I wrote to them and said they had a great magazine. I'd like to be a part of it. They wrote back and invited me for an interview and said, well, they kind of need some help with marketing. And I wrote a 10-page marketing plan over the weekend and sent it in, and they hired me on the basis of that. And I was director of marketing. At this same time, Miotai Trees opened up Fire Lotus Endo a block away from the Tricycle office. And all this is 2 blocks away from the Chelsea Hotel. So I had this turnkey conversion to a Buddhist identity and a Buddhist practice. And at 24 years old, I had this job of promoting the Buddha Dharma using the tools of consumer marketing. I put myself into that job. By every metric, I had great success. I talked to Alan Senaki and Dolly Gattosi in that role, and increased subscriptions and ad sales. But within a couple of years, the editor-in-chief turned against me and ended up firing me from that job for reasons that were kind of obscure to me. This was the occasion for me to move out to Berkeley. I got a job at Parallax Press. Before I went, I spent a month in Zen Mountain Monastery, and Dido Lowy said, "Oh, you should look up Mel Weitzman. He's a good teacher." First day I arrived in Berkeley in June of 1994, I found my way to Berkeley Zen Center and started practicing there. And I worked at Parallax Press, and I tell it as a story, a parable of the two coasts. The New York City Buddhist office created a lot of innovative, intelligent, new work, but it was personally abusive. In the California Buddhist office, everybody was nice as could be, and nothing ever happened. And after a couple of years, I left there frustrated with this task of trying to create my life through my professional ambition. I just was a temp and practiced. But at this time, I had a problem, right? And this problem just stayed in my way, whatever I did. I did 100 hours of therapy. I wrote 300 pages of a novel. I did all kinds of acting out to try and shake this problem. But whatever I did, it was right in my face. One morning, I was working at Bank of America. I had a minimum wage job with $1 million view. And I stopped. And I looked at this problem without flinching, without bracing myself, without waiting or wishing for anything to be different. I just looked directly at this problem. And it was evident to me that this problem, which had bent the arc of my life, this problem which had occupied me for years, existed only in my imagination. In fact, all my problems existed only in my imagination. My mind was a problem-making machine. Whatever the input, the output was some kind of dilemma. Seeing this, I felt space open up in front of me. And I felt space open up behind me. And I felt space open up to my right and to my left. I felt space open up above me and below me. And in this spaciousness, I heard a voice address me. You can be whatever you want to be. As though, having completed some journey, my next footfall could land anywhere. Immediately I said, I want to be practice and service. And I can't tell you what happened next, but it was my sensibility that that wish was granted in its request. And I knew at once, and can confirm 29 years later, that was the end of depression and anxiety in my life. I was here that afternoon. I was here for everything for a number of years. But within weeks, however, I was burning up. There was this current of energy coming from my belly through the top of my head. It buzzed in the top of my head. It pulled on the left side of my face, creating this rictus. It was a physical heat. My abdomen was hot to the touch. And it was joyful and excruciating and going on every waking hour. It was fed by practice as a flame is fed by the bellows. And I turned to Sojin, trusting him as a doctor of the varieties of religious experience. Came to him and said, what is this burning? And he deflected the question. Asked him again next month, what is this burning? And he deflected the question. Next month, I asked him again, and he said, don't try to understand it conceptually, just turn towards it in intimacy. Okay, I could understand what he was telling me, and I could put it into practice, and it matched what other Zen people said. And this is truthful advice, and if I could have followed it all the way, it might have been helpful. But as I tell my story, this was an unfortunate turn. I had this powerful current of energy and no vocabulary to even understand it within myself. So I had rather more velocity than navigation. I also had a half conscious idea that this burning could awaken bodhicitta and others. I thought it was a path to what that Tibetan man could do. And having that half conscious understanding, I'd never have a better dream than that. But practice was burning, burning was practice. Let's just burn this house down to the ground. And even as I could sort of hang with my own intensity, it didn't work in my life. Friends disappeared. Sojin refused to give me jukai, even as I was sitting every period of zazen. Above all, my marriage ended, and in my emotional body, I would tell you, my wife left me. Even as inside, I had utter clarity of purpose. Outside, there was the absence of harmony. After my marriage ended, I moved in next door with a couple of Zen students. And what I remember much about that is having parties and inviting Zen Center people, just a different spirit. After a couple of years, my girlfriend Diana became pregnant, and we decided we could make a family together, and we had to move a few blocks away. A number of threads that come together with this. One is I was challenged to have a professional skill that could support a family. And so I went and got a master's degree at transpersonal counseling at John F. Kennedy University. And among the things that could happen there is I could figure out how to find professional help for this burning which persisted. And I approached a couple of psychologists who put out a shingle for the treatment of the Kundalini process. One of them said, "Oh, yeah, that's definitely what's going on for you." One of them never quite said that, but just to have this mirror, this vocabulary, this map that I was on was really reassuring to me. And I could see with this mirror that what was going on wasn't important. It wasn't any better or worse than anything else. Right? And I was able to bring this burning to a rest. And there's some learning for me in Zen. We emphasize innocence and no knowing, but I understand sometimes you have to write your story before you can forget it. Another pivotal thing at John F. Kennedy University is just coming into fashion to talk about the vagus nerve. And I may have developed an idiosyncratic interpretation, but I heard the heart is embedded in a web of neurons and the belly is embedded in a web of neurons. And we have this ubiquitous figurative language of knowing things in our heart and feeling things in our gut. But I understood that isn't figurative, that's literal. Both the heart and the gut can be understood to be seats of consciousness, even if they're not seats of thinking. And even as in our society, we're all in our heads. An integrated person, I thought, is balanced between body, heart, and mind. I was going to graduate school. I was working 30 hours a week. I was doing 40 hours of childcare. At this time, it wasn't possible for me to have an hour to myself to sit zazen. But at this time, I found that the Hare Krishna temple up the street had a service every day at noon. And I could go and bring my child, bring my son, and he could cry, he could run around, he could scream. There was no silence for him to disrupt. And joining that service, I took up that practice. And I just remember that as a very happy time. I'm in the California sunshine, pushing my child around the city, going to parks and praying. Life will never get better than that. You know, I didn't plan to be a parent, but it's a life I love. And it can't be better. It's such a treasure to have the purpose of your life in arm's reach. And if I understood myself to be training and being balanced with body, heart, and mind, well, being a feminist parent with no gender roles is a perfect school for that. And there may have been things I've gotten wrong as a parent, but I know the most important thing I got exactly right, which is every day my children are beautiful to me. Every day I'm happy to see them. Every day I create security for them, physical and emotional, so that they can grow up to be themselves without any extra anxiety. To know that the most important thing I did in the right way, the most important responsibility, I can feel like a king on a throne. But to reach for a shadow side, I'd also point to, I was an intern at a counseling center in Oakland, and I thought I was doing a good job. But the executive director, just as with tricycle, swerved against me in ways that seemed erratic and fired me. And that was an obstacle that I didn't overcome to being a licensed therapist. And I spent the last 15 years taking telephone calls for a mental health insurance company, which at best is an easy way to make a living. I approached Sojin and Hozan for 25, 30 years, and I tell you, the legacy of that for me is I failed to enter their circle of trust or respect or concern. And the doors I knocked on to enter society remain closed to me. There's one person of an older generation who gave me a hand up in life. And that's our neighbor, Virginia Howell. She started out as a friend of Berkeley Zen Center, but towards the end, she would terrorize Zen students, screaming at them, screaming at Sojin for boundaries in her mind. But she loved me and loved my family. And when she had to sell the house, she really extended herself to allow Diana and I to buy this home next door that we live in. And it's not my path yet to have gratitude towards any teacher, but you, my friends, have made it possible for me to fulfill this dream I had at 16 of living a religious life, practicing every day, but then also to have these treasures of a wife and children. In the past 2 years, I've taken up another Zen practice. I chant and I count the Prajna Paramita mantra, Om Gate Gate, Paragate, Parasamgate, Bodhisvaha. And I do that 2,000 times a day. I've done that for 770 days now. And look forward to the opportunity sometime this practice period to talk about that with you. I'll set up the schedule for teas. I'll post that on the bulletin board later today, but I want to take advantage of this opportunity to spend time with you, and I'd accept other invitations to meet as well. And I know I'm looking forward to this opportunity to set aside some of my other responsibilities and focus more intensely on practice. And I invite you to join me in that, and we'll make something beautiful together. Thank you.
Hey, Mark. We have a few minutes for questions or comments. If anyone has one, please raise your digital hand and let Karen spotlight you so Mark can find you. Lori.
Hi, Mark. Damn. You have a great story. I think you have more hours in your day than I do, or something, or in your life, or whatever. Anyway, I just want to appreciate you and thank you for your invitation and your revealing yourself. And I just has been really meaningful and enjoyable for me, first to raise my family and then to witness you raising yours. And you're a wonderful father. And I look forward to finding out more about your Dharma.
You've also been an inspiration to me, Lori. So thank you. Yeah.
Anna, did you raise your hand?
Yeah, thank you. Mark, it's so inspiring and exciting to hear your story. Thank you so much for sharing it so fully. I'm looking forward to hearing more and understanding more as we go through the practice period. Thank you.
You're welcome, Hannah. Thank you.
Marley.
Mark, thank you for sharing so much of yourself in this talk. And hilariously, I also attended Fire Lotus Temple something like 30 years later, in the 2010s. So we have a strange connection there. But uh, but also I feel like this your story and talking through this very strong sense of, I feel like, seeking of really that way-seeking mind is very apparent in your many long twists and turns to find ways to practice in these different moments of your life. Um, and I feel like this story really, it feels very appropriate to this practice period where we are going to be studying the Lotus Sutra, which is so devotional in its character and nature. And I feel like there's a real harmony with you as a Shuso and what we're working on right now. So thank you for all of that. Um, I feel like I don't have a particular question so much as I'm glad to hear your story, and I will certainly be reaching out to talk to you a little more about some of these experiences.
I love that, Marley. And it has been an ongoing consideration in my life. What is devotion in Zen practice and Buddhism? I have it in other religions. And so this is something that a question that I carry. I'd be glad to talk to you more.
Absolutely. Thank you.
I'm terribly sorry, folks. That is all the time we have this morning. I've put Mark's email address in the chat. So if you want to reach out to him that way, you can. Sounds like he's very open to being reached out to. And it's time to do our closing vows. Being I vow to awaken
With them,
delusions
are inexhaustible.
impossible. I
I
vow
vow
to
to
end
them.
Dharma gates
It's
are boundless.
us.
I
I
vow to enter them. Buddha's way is unsurpassable. I vow to become it.
Good morning again. And here are some announcements for today. This Thursday, we begin our Lotus Sutra class. The sign up and details are on the website, and it's in hybrid format. This Friday afternoon, in place of evening zazen, our abiding teachers will offer a zazen refresher in hybrid format. And this Saturday's Dharma talk will be given by Reverend Michael McCormick, a Nichiren priest and scholar of the Lotus Sutra. So thank you so much, Mark, and thank you, Peter, and please feel free to unmute and say hello.
Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank
It
you.
was so beautiful.
Thank you, Mark.
Yeah.
Mark.
Bye. Hear more.
Thanks, Mark. Good morning, everyone.
Great
Good
story.
morning. Thank you.
Thank you.
Morning, everyone. Have a
Thank
great
you,
day.
Mark.
Yeah, have a
Great
good
one.
day,
Thanks
everyone.
everyone for coming.
Thank you, Ron.